Have you ever wondered what really goes on behind the gilded doors of the palace? We see Meghan Markle smiling, poised, radiant in front of the cameras, effortlessly charming the public and press alike. But what if I told you that the picture everyone sees is only a fraction of the truth? What if that radiant smile hides a storm inside? A storm so intense that it has left seasoned palace staff in tears, driven some to resign, and even shocked those closest to her. Today, at 47, a former royal butler, someone who has served with unwavering loyalty for decades, finally lifts the veil on a side of Meghan Markle that the world has long suspected but never dared to confirm. And what he reveals isn't just surprising, it's deeply unsettling. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace is a place of rules, rituals, and appearances. Etiquette is enforced with ironclad discipline. Every gesture, every word, every smile is measured, calculated, and often scrutinized by hundreds of invisible eyes. The public sees only the surface. Meghan greeting children, attending galas, walking beside Prince Harry with grace. But according to the butler, the reality behind those closed doors is starkly different. He describes her as smiling in public while being explosive and unpredictable in private, leaving staff emotionally drained, sometimes even in tears. It's a duality that most can hardly imagine. A public figure adored, a private figure feared. And it's this very contrast that makes his account so shocking. Why is this story surfacing now? Why did this butler wait until 47 to speak? The answer lies not only in timing, but in the weight of the revelations. Speaking about the private life of a royal is no small matter. Legal threats, public scrutiny, and the intricate web of palace secrecy have long kept insiders silent. Yet this butler reached a point where the truth had to be told, even if it meant personal risk. And his timing is impeccable. Meghan and Harry remain at the center of media scrutiny, their every move analyzed, their every word dissected. New projects, high-profile appearances, and the ever-expanding public fascination with their lives make this exposé feel especially urgent. The former butler recounts incidents that, on their own, might seem like minor outbursts, but collectively, they paint a pattern of behavior that staff could no longer ignore. There were moments of unexpected rage over the smallest perceived slights, a misplaced item, a late schedule, a dish prepared incorrectly. The butler's recollections are precise, almost surgical, highlighting not just what happened, but how it happened. The tension in the staff rooms, the fear in the hallways, and the whispered apologies became the unspoken rhythm of daily life. Staff members who had once admired and respected the Duchess found themselves walking on eggshells, never quite certain which Meghan they would encounter that day. Imagine working in a palace where the line between admiration and terror blurs, where you must anticipate not only the public image but the private reactions, the hidden tempers, the unpredictable moods. According to the butler, there were days when the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Routine tasks became fraught with anxiety. Every simple interaction carried the potential for a sudden emotional explosion. And it wasn't just the junior staff who felt this pressure. Senior aides, seasoned professionals who had navigated the royal household for decades, sometimes found themselves unable to cope. There are accounts of staffers walking away from positions they had dedicated their lives to, unable to endure the stress of navigating Meghan's private temper. What's particularly startling is the butler's assertion that Meghan's behavior often came in stark contradiction to her public persona. To the outside world, she is composed, poised, charitable, and measured. But behind closed doors, the demeanor described is markedly different, explosive, unpredictable, and, at times, cruel. Staff would find themselves caught in sudden emotional storms, unsure how to respond, fearing the repercussions of misstepping. The disparity between public perception and private reality raises troubling questions. How much of what we see in the media is genuine, and how much is carefully curated? How does one reconcile a public figure adored for warmth and charm with the reports of emotional volatility behind the scenes? The former butler recounts one particularly harrowing incident that has stayed with him for years. A long-serving member of the household, someone known for their loyalty and discretion, had worked tirelessly to prepare an event, ensuring every detail met the Duchess's exacting standards. Yet when Meghan entered the room, something, perhaps a misplaced napkin or a dish slightly out of alignment, triggered a reaction so intense that the staffer left the room in tears, questioning their competence despite decades of experience. This was not an isolated event, the butler emphasizes. Small irritations often escalated into disproportionately intense reactions, leaving staff members emotionally exhausted and increasingly anxious about the unpredictable environment they had to navigate. And yet, it's not as though Meghan was merely temperamental. The butler stresses her intelligence, her meticulousness, her ability to inspire loyalty when she chose to. The problem lay in the volatility, in the inconsistency. One day, encouragement and praise. The next, explosive anger over minor oversights. This unpredictability created a climate of fear, tension, and hypervigilance. Staff had to learn not just to anticipate her needs, but to anticipate her moods. Every smile, every word, every glance had to be interpreted with caution. One misread signal could provoke an emotional storm, leaving a staff member bewildered, humiliated, or in tears. Throughout these accounts, a recurring theme emerges. Meghan's public composure masks a private storm. She understands the optics. She knows the cameras are always watching, the headlines scrutinizing. Her public persona is flawless. Her private persona, according to those who have experienced it firsthand, is a different story entirely. The butler describes moments of quiet calculation, interspersed with sudden, unpredictable eruptions of anger, creating a climate where staff never knew what to expect. This duality, the smiling Duchess versus the volatile private figure, has left many questioning not just the impact on palace staff, but the implications for the royal institution itself. The revelation of such a duality invites the audience to question everything they thought they knew about Meghan Markle. Could this behavior help explain the wave of staff departures during her tenure? Could it shed light on the increasing tensions reported between her and other members of the royal family? The butler's account, coming after years of silence, provides a perspective rarely, if ever, heard publicly. And while it's important to consider these claims critically, the patterns and anecdotes he recounts are consistent, detailed, and deeply compelling. For many viewers, the most shocking element is the humanity of the staff caught in the crossfire. These are not passive observers. They are professionals performing their duties with care, dedication, and loyalty. And yet, the intensity of Meghan's reactions could reduce even the most seasoned individuals to tears. The emotional toll, the strain on mental health, and the erosion of confidence among staff members reveal a hidden cost to what many perceive as a glamorous life. It challenges the perception that life within the palace is solely a realm of privilege and luxury, exposing instead a dimension of stress, fear, and emotional turbulence. As the butler recounts these events, a picture emerges of a household living in constant anticipation of the next emotional upheaval. Staff learned to read subtle cues, the tone of voice, the shift in expression, the slightest sign of dissatisfaction. Meetings, meal preparations, public appearances, all became exercises in careful orchestration, not just for optics, but for personal safety, emotional preservation, and professional survival. The stakes were higher than many could imagine, and the fallout extended beyond the individual, affecting morale, trust, and cohesion within the royal household. And yet, there's a deeper layer to consider. Why does such behavior remain hidden from the public eye? Partly, it's the protective veil of royalty, the discretion demanded of staff, the legal and social repercussions of speaking out. But partly, it's the image itself, a polished, elegant public persona designed to inspire admiration, not fear. It is this duality, this careful curation of appearance versus reality, that has allowed such behavior to persist, unchallenged, for years. And now, with the butler's revelations, that veil is finally lifting. The stage is set for a story of contrasts, charm and volatility, loyalty and fear, public adoration and private turmoil. The butler's account promises to illuminate the hidden dimensions of Meghan Markle's tenure within the palace, revealing incidents that range from unsettling to shocking, emotional to bewildering. And while these revelations may surprise some, Others may find them aligning with long-held suspicions, whispers, and anecdotal reports. But what came next? The moments the butler describes as the most explosive, the incidents that pushed staff to the brink, would change everything. The public-facing smile, the composed demeanor, the flawless appearances, all would be re-examined in light of what occurred behind closed doors. And the most striking part? Some of the actions, according to the butler, had implications far beyond staff morale. They reverberated through the palace itself, influencing decisions, relationships, and the very perception of the royal family in the eyes of the world. This is where the story truly begins. The veil is lifted, but the storm has only just been glimpsed. And what comes next, as the butler continues to speak, will challenge everything you thought you knew about Meghan Markle. The question now is simple. Are you ready to see the side of royalty that the cameras never show? What happens when the public face of royalty hides a storm behind closed doors? When the smile everyone adores masks moments of pure unpredictability. According to the former royal butler, Meghan Markle's private temper was something that even the most seasoned palace staff struggled to navigate. And what he's about to reveal will make you see her in a completely different light. It all started subtly, the butler says. In the beginning, Meghan was polite, attentive, charming even in private settings. Staff members remember early days where her warmth seemed genuine, her attention thoughtful. But cracks appeared quickly. Small irritations, misplaced silverware, a slightly uneven floral arrangement, or even a delayed schedule could trigger reactions that left staff stunned. One day, a seemingly trivial incident at a formal dinner preparation escalated into a scene so intense that junior staff were reduced to tears, scrambling to fix errors they hadn't even realized they'd made. And it wasn't just the small stuff. The former butler recalls incidents that showed a remarkable intensity of emotion, a volatility that could swing from calm to explosive in mere seconds. He described moments when Meghan would suddenly raise her voice, pacing the room, gestures sharp, eyes flashing. Staff were left standing silently, unsure how to respond. Should they apologize? Should they retreat? Should they try to reason with her? Every instinct they had to maintain composure was tested, every professional boundary stretched to the limit. One staff member, the butler recounts, had worked in the royal household for decades. Experienced, poised, someone who had weathered countless palace dramas and crises. Yet, when confronted with Meghan's sudden outburst over a minor scheduling issue, this seasoned aide found themselves shaking, nearly in tears, questioning their own competence. "I've never seen anyone react like this," the butler said. "Not even under the most stressful situations. It was like a switch flipped, and no one could predict when it would happen again." The unpredictability wasn't just frightening, it was exhausting. Staff began to anticipate reactions, walking on eggshells, calculating every word, every movement. A smile could quickly become a target if misinterpreted. A joke could land dangerously if timing or tone was wrong. Meghan's private behavior demanded a hyper-awareness from staff that was both mentally and emotionally draining. And yet, the public had no idea. To them, she remained poised, elegant, the model of royal composure. The butler also points out something critical. The duality wasn't always conscious. There were moments when Meghan seemed genuinely frustrated, emotionally raw, expressing anger that had been simmering for hours or even days. But there were other moments when the outbursts seemed deliberate, a way to assert control, to test boundaries, to see how far staff would bend under pressure. Some staff began to fear her not just because of unpredictable anger, but because it became a tool of power within the household. And this raises an uncomfortable question. How much of what staff endured was accidental, and how much was strategic? The former butler doesn't claim to know motives, but he is clear about effects. Staff morale declined. Fear became a constant companion. Mistakes, no matter how small, were amplified, and the mental strain on those who had dedicated their lives to serving the royal family was immense. It's one thing to deal with rigorous standards. It's another entirely to endure an environment where a single oversight could provoke a storm of emotion. But the story doesn't stop there. According to the butler, the volatility sometimes extended into what can only be described as moments of intimidation. Staff recount seeing Meghan glare across a room, commanding attention without speaking, a presence so intense that those in her path instinctively froze. Meetings and preparations could suddenly shift from routine coordination to tense, emotionally charged encounters. Staff learned to read subtle cues, the tightening of a jaw, the narrowing of eyes, the way her smile could transform from warmth into something almost menacing. One particular incident, which the butler says haunts him to this day, involved a minor wardrobe oversight before a public engagement. Meghan had requested a specific dress for a charity appearance, and a small alteration had been overlooked. When she saw it, the reaction was instantaneous, sharp, and unpredictable. Staff scrambled, apologies were made, but the emotional impact lingered. The aide responsible reportedly left the room in tears, shaking from the intensity of the confrontation, while others silently consoled each other, trying to regain composure before the public event. It wasn't just one-time incidents. The pattern emerged repeatedly. The butler details multiple episodes where seemingly minor missteps resulted in disproportionate reactions, sometimes spilling over into long periods of tension, awkward silence, and strained interactions. The palace, with all its traditions, hierarchy, and protocols, became a stage where staff performed not just their duties, but a delicate dance to avoid the unpredictable tempers of the Duchess. And yet, there's another layer to this story: the staff themselves. These aren't inexperienced interns or casual workers. These are trained professionals, people who have navigated royal households, diplomatic events, and intricate social hierarchies. For them to experience fear, anxiety, and even tears as a result of one individual's behavior speaks volumes about the intensity and consistency of the situation. Staff members didn't just feel challenged. They felt intimidated, unsure of when or how the next outburst might occur, uncertain if their careers, reputations, or even mental health might be at stake. The butler paints a vivid picture: a palace where preparation and poise are paramount, yet tension simmers under every surface. Staff members walking silently through hallways, anticipating moods, mentally rehearsing responses. The dining room, where protocols are meticulous, transforms into a pressure cooker when the Duchess is dissatisfied. Even public appearances, carefully choreographed and rehearsed, are preceded by private moments of high tension, where staff brace for reactions that might never come or might arrive suddenly, without warning. Perhaps the most striking revelation is the emotional impact on staff loyalty. People who had long admired and respected Meghan found themselves torn. On the one hand, they recognized her intelligence, charisma, and public dedication. On the other hand, her volatility created a work environment that was difficult, sometimes unbearable. Some staffers considered resignation, others sought transfers, and some silently endured, hoping the storm would pass. The butler recounts moments of whispered conversations, muted sighs, and private tears behind closed doors. These are the human costs, the unseen consequences of navigating a royal household under intense emotional scrutiny. And yet, Meghan's public image remained untarnished. Cameras captured smiles, handshakes, elegant gestures. Interviews highlighted charm, poise, and empathy. The contrast between the public persona and private behavior creates a striking narrative: a woman adored on every cover, yet feared by those closest to her in daily life. The butler's account forces a reconsideration of what we see versus what is real. How much of the persona projected to the world is carefully managed, and how much of the private behavior affects those who make that image possible? What makes these revelations even more compelling is the consistency and specificity of the butler's anecdotes. This isn't vague speculation or rumor. These are detailed accounts, complete with context, timing, and the emotional aftermath. Staff reactions are not generalized. They are personal, raw, and emotionally charged. The narrative he shares paints a complex picture of Meghan Markle as someone capable of both public grace and private intensity, a figure who inspires loyalty, fear, and uncertainty all at once. And while some might argue that such behavior is simply the stress of royal life, the butler is clear: the volatility was notable, excessive, and repeated. It left a lasting mark on the household. Staff who once felt pride in serving the royal family found themselves constantly questioning their own actions, second-guessing decisions, and bracing for confrontations that could come without warning. The psychological and emotional weight of this environment cannot be overstated. So the question becomes, how does one reconcile these dual realities? How do we understand a person who appears publicly composed, charitable, and charming, yet privately unpredictable, volatile, and emotionally intense? The Butler doesn't offer judgments. He simply recounts what he observed, leaving the audience to grapple with the contrast. And it's precisely this tension, this stark juxtaposition, that makes the story so riveting, so necessary, so impossible to ignore. But what came next? The moment that truly tested the limits of staff endurance, the incident that became a defining example of this volatility, was something even more shocking. It involved not just anger or frustration, but a confrontation that exposed the sheer unpredictability of Meghan's private behavior, leaving Eve. But what came next? The moment that truly tested the limits of staff endurance, the incident that became a defining example of this volatility, was something even more shocking. It involved not just anger or frustration, but a confrontation that exposed the sheer unpredictability of Meghan's private behavior, leaving everyone involved questioning what could happen next. And that story is what we explore in the next chapter, where the Butler describes an encounter that, according to him, changed the household forever. Have you ever witnessed someone completely lose control in a room full of people who are trained to remain calm under pressure? Imagine a room steeped in centuries of royal tradition, where every movement, every word, every gesture is calculated. Now imagine that, in the midst of this controlled environment, someone unleashes a torrent of emotion so intense it freezes everyone in place. According to the former royal butler, that's exactly what happened one fateful afternoon in the royal household, and Meghan Markle was at the center of it all. The incident began innocuously enough, or so staff thought. A routine wardrobe check for a public engagement, a task repeated countless times, was underway. Meghan had requested a specific ensemble for a high-profile charity event, and everything seemed in order. Yet the butler recalls that the moment she entered the room, her gaze landed on a minor detail, a piece of jewelry slightly misaligned. To any outsider, the discrepancy was barely noticeable. But for Meghan, it was enough. The butler describes her reaction as immediate. A flash of irritation crossed her face, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. What followed, according to his account, was an eruption of intensity that left everyone in the room stunned. Staff who had worked decades in royal households found themselves scrambling, voices barely audible as they attempted to explain or rectify the situation. It was like watching a storm form in seconds, the butler said. You could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Everyone instinctively froze, unsure if they would survive the next few minutes unscathed. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just the volume or the sharp words. It was the unpredictability. Meghan alternated between calm reasoning and sudden bursts of anger, moving through the room with a presence so commanding that even the most senior aides felt powerless. Staff later described the experience as walking a tightrope over a pit, unsure which step might trigger a fall. Every apology was met with a piercing glare, every explanation cut short by a pointed gesture or a sharp tone. And then came the tears. Junior staffers, young individuals who had devoted themselves to royal service with pride and dedication, began quietly weeping, not out of sadness alone, but out of shock, fear, and sheer disbelief. One aide, the butler recounts, had barely made a mistake, yet felt as though the world had collapsed around them. The emotional toll was instantaneous. The room that moments ago had been bustling with preparation became silent, tense, and heavy with anxiety. What's even more remarkable, the butler emphasizes, is that this wasn't an isolated incident. Meghan's volatility, he claims, was a recurring pattern. She could be affectionate, polite, and even charming one moment, then unpredictable and explosive the next. Staff had to constantly anticipate mood swings, creating an environment where fear and tension were ever present. You never knew what would set her off, the butler said. Even a compliment or a joke could be misconstrued. Staff learned to tread lightly, always calculating, always cautious. The incident in the wardrobe room became more than just a moment of private temper. It was a turning point. It highlighted the stark contrast between Meghan's public persona and private behavior. Cameras captured her smiling, poised, and graceful, while staff endured a completely different reality behind closed doors. The duality was jarring, and for those in her immediate presence, exhausting. But the story doesn't stop there. What makes this episode particularly striking is how it affected the dynamics among staff. Senior aides, once confident and assured, began to question their own judgment. Junior staffers, previously eager and motivated, felt demoralized. The palace, with its centuries-old protocols and strict hierarchies, suddenly felt unstable. The butler recalls whispered conversations, discreet sighs, and tense glances exchanged in hallways. Everyone knew something had shifted, but no one knew how to fix it, or if it could even be fixed. Then there's the element of unpredictability. Staff began developing informal systems to anticipate Meghan's moods. Certain gestures, the timing of entries, the order of presentations, each became a potential trigger or pacifier. The butler recounts that staff would rehearse scenarios, discussing in hushed tones how to avoid a misstep that could provoke anger. It became a form of emotional survival, a coping mechanism to navigate an environment where uncertainty was constant. And yet, despite the fear and tension, Meghan's intelligence and charisma remained undeniable. Staff would note the contradictions. She could be empathetic, articulate, and engaging in one moment, then intimidating, sharp, and mercurial in the next. The duality was, according to the butler, part of what made her so compelling yet so difficult to work with. There was brilliance in her public persona and brilliance in her strategic thinking, but behind the scenes, the volatility created a very different story. Some staff members began to wonder if these outbursts were intentional, a way to assert dominance, to test limits, to maintain control. The butler is careful to clarify that he cannot speak to intent, only to the effects. But the impact on staff morale, cohesion, and emotional stability was undeniable. Mistakes, even unintentional ones, were magnified, creating an environment of anxiety that permeated every corner of the household. The most shocking part, he adds, is how Meghan herself seemed to navigate the aftermath. Publicly, she would continue as if nothing had occurred, projecting grace and poise. Privately, however, the emotional echoes lingered, with staff silently managing the fallout. The butler emphasizes that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a recurring pattern. A series of intense episodes that left staff emotionally drained and constantly on edge. And then there was the human cost. The butler recounts staff members who struggled with anxiety, some seeking therapy, others quietly leaving the household. The intensity of Meghan's private behavior, while not always directed maliciously, had real, tangible effects on the people around her. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances or completing duties. It was about surviving emotionally in a space that demanded constant vigilance. The wardrobe incident became emblematic, a story that circulated quietly among staff as a warning, a lesson in unpredictability, and a source of whispered anxiety. It exemplified the duality the butler had been trying to convey. Public charm versus private intensity. The smile seen by millions contrasted with the private storm experienced by those closest to her. And what's even more intriguing, the butler notes, is the ripple effect beyond the immediate staff. Friends, collaborators, and even extended members of the household began to notice patterns, subtle shifts in tone, and the tension that followed Meghan wherever she went. It created a climate where everyone was hyper-aware, always anticipating the next flashpoint, always adjusting to maintain harmony in the face of unpredictability. Yet, despite the intensity, Meghan remained a figure of fascination and admiration. Public appearances, media coverage, and philanthropic work continued to project an image of warmth, charisma, and dedication. The contrast between public perception and private reality raises difficult questions. How much do we really know about public figures? How much is carefully curated? And how much is hidden behind closed doors? And more importantly, what does it take to endure such contradictions day after day? The butler leaves us with a chilling thought. This wardrobe incident, while extreme, was only one of many episodes that revealed the depth of Meghan's private temper. Staff learned, quickly and painfully, that appearances could be deceiving. And while the public remained unaware, The palace experienced the emotional reality in stark, vivid detail. But what happened next was something that would escalate the stakes even further. A confrontation that not only tested staff endurance, but also revealed a side of Meghan that, until now, had remained largely unseen. An incident so intense, so extraordinary, that the butler admits it left even the most seasoned aides questioning everything they thought they knew. And that story is what we explore in the next chapter, where the private storm meets a tipping point that no one could have predicted. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone's private rage, the kind of fury that's hidden behind a public smile? The former royal butler doesn't just speculate. He's lived it. And the event he recalls next is unlike anything that had happened before. It wasn't a mere wardrobe disagreement or a misunderstood request. No, this was an emotional storm, a private explosion so intense that it reverberated throughout the palace walls, leaving everyone involved shaken, bewildered, and, in some cases, in tears. It began with what seemed like an ordinary meeting. Meghan had convened a small group of staff for a discussion about an upcoming charitable initiative. The goal was simple: coordinate schedules, review speeches, and align on public appearances. But the atmosphere quickly shifted. According to the butler, Meghan arrived with an energy that was palpable, sharp, alert, almost electric. She greeted staff warmly, smiled, even laughed at a few polite jokes. But then, without warning, her demeanor flipped. The trigger? A minor scheduling conflict, the kind that any experienced team would handle with calm efficiency. But for Meghan, it was more than a conflict. It was a challenge to her control, a disruption of her meticulously planned narrative. The butler recalls that her eyes narrowed, her voice hardened, and the warmth vanished in an instant. Staff felt the change before she even spoke, a silent warning that the room was no longer safe for mistakes or hesitation. What followed was a rapid-fire series of criticisms, each more cutting than the last. The butler describes the moment in detail. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Every word felt like a scalpel, precise, deliberate, leaving cuts that were both sharp and deep. Staff were scrambling, not to make amends, but simply to survive the barrage. One aide, relatively new to the household, attempted to explain the scheduling discrepancy, only to be met with an icy stare and a pointed question that made the room fall silent. "Do you understand how important this is? Do you understand the consequences if I'm not prepared?" The question was rhetorical. Everyone understood the stakes, but the intensity of the delivery magnified the fear. The butler admits that what happened next is something he struggled to describe even years later. Meghan's frustration escalated, moving from verbal reprimands to sharp gestures, abrupt movements, and a commanding presence that dominated the room. Staff who had spent decades in royal service found themselves paralyzed, unsure whether to speak, move, or even breathe. "You could see it in their eyes," the butler said. They were caught between duty and self-preservation, and the line between the two was terrifyingly thin. It wasn't just anger, it was unpredictability. Meghan shifted from stern to cold, from cold to sarcastic, from sarcastic to almost sweet, only to pivot back to intensity. The staff had no roadmap, no script, no precedent to guide them. Every action, every glance, every word was scrutinized, judged, and potentially punished. Not with formal reprimands, but with emotional consequences that left people emotionally exhausted. And then came the breaking point. A misunderstanding over a simple line in a speech draft led to a direct confrontation. Meghan reportedly slammed the folder onto the table, a loud, sharp noise that echoed through the room and startled everyone. Her voice, which moments ago had been measured, now rose to a level that filled the chamber, leaving no space for doubt or misinterpretation. Staff cowered, some ducking slightly as if the intensity could physically hit them. One junior aide, the butler recalls, quietly began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, almost imperceptible sob. But Meghan noticed. And instead of softening, instead of pausing to assess the emotional state of the room, she intensified her scrutiny, questioning every detail, demanding absolute precision, perfection, and obedience. The effect was devastating. Other staff members felt the tension like a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders, constricting their ability to function normally. The butler emphasizes that this wasn't maliciousness in the traditional sense. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, but it was control, a need to dominate the space, to assert authority in a way that left no room for error. And the emotional consequences were very real. Staff began to whisper afterward, cautiously, in the hallways, sharing their experiences, their anxiety, their shock. Some spoke of sleepless nights, others of moments where they questioned their own competence. Yet, in the public eye, Meghan continued to shine. Cameras, photographers, and media coverage captured a woman of grace, charm, and dedication. It was a stark contrast to the private chaos staff endured, highlighting a duality that few outside the inner circle could understand. The butler explains that this duality was part of Meghan's strategy, or at least part of her personality. A public image that inspired admiration and private behavior that demanded obedience, emotional labor, and constant vigilance. What makes this incident particularly noteworthy, according to the butler, is the long-term impact. Staff morale, already delicate from previous episodes, suffered a significant blow. Some began seeking transfers or leaving the household entirely. The emotional cost was measurable, and yet, there was little recourse. The hierarchical structure of the palace, steeped in tradition and rigid protocols, offered few avenues for addressing the psychological toll. Staff were left to navigate it silently, internalizing stress and anxiety while outwardly maintaining decorum. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Meghan's ability to oscillate between extremes, the charm and the temper, the public grace and private intensity, created a psychological tension that kept staff constantly alert, constantly guessing. It was exhausting, but also strangely magnetic. Even staff who were distressed by her behavior acknowledged her charisma, her intelligence, her strategic thinking. They found themselves simultaneously intimidated and captivated, a dynamic that added layers of complexity to their work environment. The butler recounts a particular moment after the confrontation, when Meghan left the room as quickly as she had entered. The staff were left in stunned silence, processing what had just occurred. Senior aides exchanged glances, unsure how to debrief, how to normalize the environment, how to recover from the emotional fallout. It wasn't just an event, it was a test, an initiation into the unpredictable world of Meghan Markle behind closed doors. And the ripple effects extended beyond the immediate staff. Meetings that followed, even mundane planning sessions, were influenced by the incident. Every interaction became a calculated exercise, with aides anticipating possible triggers, rehearsing responses, and measuring emotional distance. The butler notes that this heightened state of alertness became a standard part of daily life for anyone working closely with Meghan. Yet, despite the chaos and emotional toll, Meghan's public image remained impeccable. Photographs, social media posts, interviews, and appearances painted a picture of warmth, confidence, and poise. The contrast between public and private personas raises uncomfortable questions about perception, reality, and the hidden challenges faced by those in her orbit. It also underscores the butler's central claim. The Meghan that the world saw was only part of the story. The private side, the temper, the unpredictability, the intense control, was a reality that staff had to navigate daily. And just when the staff thought they had endured the worst, the butler recalls that things escalated even further. There was an incident, more severe than the wardrobe confrontation or the meeting meltdown, that would push the limits of patience, endurance, and emotional resilience. An episode so shocking that it would forever be etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. What happened next would leave even the most seasoned aides questioning their understanding of control, loyalty, and the emotional cost of serving someone whose public smile masked a private storm. And that's the story we uncover in the next chapter, where private intensity meets an explosive confrontation that no one saw coming. Have you ever been in a room where the tension was so thick, you could almost touch it? Where every movement felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of unpredictable fury? That's exactly how the former royal butler describes the infamous confrontation that would later become a defining moment in his understanding of Meghan Markle behind closed doors. And it wasn't a minor disagreement or a fleeting burst of frustration. It was a full-blown emotional storm, one that tested loyalty, courage, and composure to their absolute limits. It began innocuously, with a briefing about an upcoming public engagement. Staff had prepared diligently. Speeches were reviewed, itineraries meticulously planned, costumes carefully selected. Everything, by all accounts, was perfect, or so they thought. Meghan entered the room, radiant in public-facing charm, yet her energy carried an underlying tension, like a storm about to break. The butler recalls the subtle cues immediately. The sharp inhale, the slight pursing of lips, the way her eyes scanned the room with an intensity that made seasoned aides shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then it happened. A minor miscommunication. One of the aides had accidentally scheduled a rehearsal at the same time as a high-profile meeting with a patron, was met not with calm discussion but with a sudden outburst. Meghan's voice, normally measured even in moments of mild frustration, rang out like a warning bell. "Do you think I have time for mistakes? Do you think the public cares about excuses?" Her questions weren't requests. They were declarations, loaded with tension, leaving staff scrambling for explanations. The butler explains that the speed and precision of her anger were almost surgical. Every word, every pause, every gesture seemed carefully aimed to assert control, to ensure compliance, and to instill a sense of accountability that bordered on fear. It was like watching a master strategist, he says. But instead of a chessboard, the pieces were people, and every wrong move had immediate consequences. One aide tried to speak, to clarify the scheduling error, but Meghan cut her off mid-sentence, her tone slicing through the room. "You need to understand something. This isn't just a..." One aide tried to speak, to clarify the scheduling error, but Meghan cut her off mid-sentence, her tone slicing through the room. "You need to understand something. This isn't just about a schedule. This is about perception, about legacy, about how the world sees me, and by extension, you. Do not ever forget that." The room fell silent. Even the most confident staff members hesitated, their mouths dry, their hands fidgeting, their minds racing to calculate the safest course of action. What struck the butler most was the unpredictability. Meghan's intensity wasn't linear. It shifted like lightning, quick, unpredictable, and impossible to anticipate. One moment she was coldly analytical, the next sarcastic, the next soft and almost maternal, only to pivot back to a sharp, commanding presence. Staff had no playbook, no prior experience that could guide them through the emotional maze. And as the confrontation escalated, the weight of uncertainty became almost unbearable. The butler recalls a particularly harrowing moment. An aide accidentally spilled a cup of tea while attempting to take notes. What should have been a minor incident became a trigger. Meghan's eyes widened, her voice sharpened, and she advanced a few steps closer to the aide, her presence dominating the space. "Do you see what carelessness does?" she demanded. "Every little thing matters. Every single thing. Do you understand that?" The aide nodded frantically, tears brimming, but Meghan wasn't finished. Staff who had previously thought themselves unshakable admitted later that they had never experienced such intensity. Some were openly sobbing, while others were frozen, clinging to composure with a determination born of necessity. And yet, Meghan's fury was interspersed with moments of charm, brief flashes of warmth that left staff bewildered, unsure whether they had survived the worst or if it was merely a pause before the next wave. The butler emphasizes that this wasn't a one-off event. The confrontation was emblematic of a pattern, a high-stakes environment in which staff were constantly tested, constantly challenged, and constantly navigating the thin line between compliance and emotional survival. It wasn't about the tea or the schedule, he says. It was about control, about expectation, about showing that there was only one way things would be done, and that was her way. What's particularly noteworthy, according to the butler, is how the staff adapted, or tried to. After the confrontation, meetings became rehearsals in psychological survival. Aides would anticipate triggers, plan responses, and mentally prepare for the emotional intensity that had become routine. Some developed strategies: never speak first, always double-check every detail, maintain a calm exterior regardless of internal turmoil. Others, however, couldn't cope, resigning themselves to the inevitable emotional toll. And yet, despite the chaos, Meghan's public persona remained immaculate. Cameras, social media posts, interviews, and public appearances continued to showcase a woman of grace, charm, and empathy. The contrast between public image and private behavior created a tension that left staff in a constant state of cognitive dissonance. How could someone so adored by the public be so fearsome behind closed doors? The butler recounts a particularly poignant example. After the confrontation, a senior aide attempted to debrief and find a way to normalize the environment. Meghan, ever strategic, intercepted the conversation, offering brief, carefully measured praise for the aide's dedication. It was a small gesture, but it worked. The emotional pendulum swung again, from fear to relief, from despair to cautious optimism. Staff were left emotionally exhausted, but also strangely captivated. They realized that surviving an encounter with Meghan was as much about reading subtle cues as it was about performing duties. And just when it seemed the confrontation had reached its peak, there was an unexpected twist. Meghan, reportedly frustrated with the lingering tension, called an impromptu team meeting late in the evening. The butler recalls the anticipation among staff, hearts pounding, minds racing, unsure whether this would be an opportunity for resolution or another test of endurance. What followed was a series of observations and directives that both praised diligence and subtly reminded staff of the consequences of failure. The lesson was clear: perfection was expected, compliance was mandatory, and emotional resilience was non-negotiable. The psychological complexity of Meghan's leadership style, as described by the butler, is profound. On one hand, she inspired dedication, loyalty, and careful attention to detail. On the other, she instilled a level of fear and unpredictability that left staff questioning their own competence, navigating a landscape in which emotional intelligence was just as crucial as professional skill. The duality was mesmerizing and exhausting in equal measure. And here's the kicker: the confrontation, intense and draining as it was, didn't end with that evening. Its ripple effects shaped interactions for weeks, influencing scheduling decisions, communication protocols, and even the choice of staff assigned to public-facing duties. Meghan's influence, the butler explains, extended far beyond individual incidents. It shaped the culture of her household, embedding a dynamic of high-intensity performance under pressure. Yet, despite all this, Meghan remained enigmatic. Staff could never fully predict her next move. They were constantly recalibrating, constantly assessing, and constantly bracing for what might come next. And that, the butler insists, is the true challenge of working in her orbit: the uncertainty, the emotional intensity, the constant negotiation between fear and admiration. But just when staff thought they had adjusted, when they believed they understood the boundaries, the rules, and the consequences, something unprecedented occurred. An event that would not only shock the staff, but also leave a lasting mark on the palace itself, challenging perceptions and forcing everyone to reevaluate what they thought they knew about Meghan Markle. What happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever witnessed someone completely unravel, yet remain a picture of composure to the world? That was the paradox unfolding within the walls of the palace on that fateful evening. Staff, still reeling from the previous confrontation, had thought they were prepared for anything. They were wrong. The incident began innocuously, almost deceptively. Meghan had requested a rehearsal of a public engagement, the type meticulously scripted down to the smallest gesture, smile, and hand wave. Normally, these rehearsals were straightforward, if intense, yet something in her mood hinted that this was different. The butler noticed it first, her footsteps sharp, her glance cutting through the room, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent that made every staff member instinctively tighten their posture. The problem began with a simple misalignment of props. One of the junior aides had positioned a floral arrangement slightly off-center from where it was meant to be. It was barely noticeable to anyone else. But for Meghan, it was catastrophic. "Do you see this?" she demanded, her eyes snapping toward the aide. "Do you see what carelessness looks like? This is what the world sees. You think they won't notice? You think they don't see every detail I have to endure because of your mistakes?" Her voice, at first measured, began to rise, slicing through the quiet room like a whip. The aide, frozen, muttered an apology, but it only fueled the storm. Meghan's temper escalated in seconds, swinging from icy calm to scorching fury. The butler describes the energy as volcanic, an uncontrollable eruption that left staff scrambling for any way to placate her. Every attempt to explain or excuse the error was met with sharper, faster critiques, and even subtle body language. Heads down, eyes averted, was not enough to mitigate the wrath. What shocked the butler most was the duality of the situation. To outsiders, Meghan would later appear smiling in interviews, waving gracefully at the cameras, embodying poise and elegance. But inside, she was unpredictable, explosive, and frighteningly precise in her criticisms. It's as if she lived in two worlds, he explains. One world where she's untouchable and adored, another where control is the only currency, and failure is punished immediately. Staff described the scene as chaotic. Some were in tears, others silently shaking, while a few were desperately trying to maintain composure, balancing fear and professionalism in equal measure. One aide admitted later that they had felt like a student being scolded in front of the entire class for the smallest misstep, a perfect metaphor for the emotionally charged environment Meghan created behind closed doors. As the confrontation progressed, Meghan's demands intensified. It wasn't just about props or timing. It was about loyalty, attention, and total alignment with her vision. She questioned decisions, scrutinized gestures, and evaluated expressions with laser precision. Every flaw became an opportunity to assert authority. And yet, in brief flashes, she offered praise, carefully calculated, almost surgical, making staff question whether relief or further anxiety was coming next. The butler recalls a moment when a senior aide, exhausted and nearly in tears, dared to suggest a minor adjustment. Meghan's response was unexpected. She leaned in, her tone lower, almost intimate, but still firm. You think I don't notice the effort you're putting in? You think I don't see the hours you've dedicated? I do. But effort is not enough. Perfection is expected. Excellence is required. And you will deliver it. The mixture of critique and acknowledgement left staff bewildered, caught between fear and admiration, a psychological tightrope that became increasingly difficult to navigate. It was during this rehearsal that the tipping point occurred. Meghan, frustrated with repeated minor mistakes, suddenly shouted a directive that left everyone stunned. It was not just the volume or intensity, it was the sheer unpredictability. Staff froze, realizing that whatever came next could escalate beyond anything they had previously experienced. And then she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving the room in stunned silence. But the aftermath was even more revealing. In the days that followed, staff discovered evidence of the emotional toll left by the incident. Whispered conversations, hastily exchanged notes about coping strategies, and in some cases, employees seeking time off to recover. The palace, often imagined as a place of order and decorum, had become a pressure cooker of fear and anticipation. The butler emphasizes that this event was not isolated. It was a pattern, a crystallization of Meghan's behind-the-scenes temperament. Staff learned to anticipate moods, prepare for unpredictability, and constantly monitor the smallest details, understanding that any deviation could provoke another storm. Yet, despite the fear and exhaustion, there was an undeniable loyalty. Born out of necessity, respect, or perhaps fascination with the intensity of her character. This incident also exposed a contradiction that would perplex staff for years. Meghan's public persona remained immaculate, charming, and approachable, while her private demeanor was volatile and exacting. Staff found themselves living in dual realities, constantly reconciling what the world saw with what they experienced. The contrast was striking, creating a narrative that would later fuel media speculation, palace gossip, and public fascination. The psychological impact on staff cannot be understated. Even seasoned aides, accustomed to protocol and precision, admitted to experiencing anxiety, stress, and self-doubt. They developed coping mechanisms, ranging from meticulous over-preparation to emotional compartmentalization. Some thrived under the challenge, while others left, unable to sustain the intensity. And through it all, Meghan remained the enigmatic figure at the center. Charming, unpredictable, exacting, and impossible to ignore. And then, just when staff thought the worst had passed, an unexpected revelation emerged. Something so startling that it forced even the most loyal aides to question everything they had assumed about Meghan Markle. The butler hints that this revelation would redefine the narrative, exposing a layer of volatility and strategic manipulation that no one had fully comprehended. It was a moment that would not only impact staff dynamics, but also ripple through the palace, creating tensions and alliances, altering responsibilities, and leaving a permanent mark on the inner workings of Meghan's household. The implications were profound, and the staff knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But what happened next was beyond anything the butler, or anyone, had anticipated. A move that would shock staff, challenge their loyalty, and reveal the true extent of Meghan Markle's explosive temper behind closed doors. And as the palace walls held their secrets, one question lingered. Could anyone truly predict what she would do next, or survive it unscathed? Imagine walking into a room and instantly sensing that something is about to break. The air feels charged, the kind of tension that makes you catch your breath, the kind that whispers, "Brace yourself." That's exactly how the palace staff felt on the day of what would later be described as Meghan Markle's most notorious private outburst yet. They had been prepared, or so they thought, but nothing could have readied them for what was about to unfold. It started with a routine schedule review. Meetings, interviews, appearances, and charity engagements were meticulously planned weeks in advance, yet Meghan had requested an unexpected change. The staff, ever diligent, scrambled to accommodate the last-minute alterations. But even minor discrepancies, an incorrectly aligned seat, a slightly misprinted agenda, sparked a reaction that would haunt the household for weeks. According to the former royal butler, the room was calm at first. Staff moved efficiently, ensuring every detail met the standard of perfection Meghan demanded. Then she arrived, radiating her usual public charm, a warm smile on her face, yet beneath it, a tension simmered. Her eyes swept the room, calculating, assessing, measuring every nuance. The butler recalls the feeling as walking on ice over a hidden chasm. One wrong step, one misjudgment, and disaster could strike. And disaster did strike. It began with a misplaced note. A junior aide had accidentally left a briefing note on the wrong desk, a trivial mistake in anyone else's world. But Meghan noticed immediately. She raised her voice, sharp and cutting, demanding to know how such carelessness could occur. The aide stammered, apologizing profusely, but Meghan's reaction intensified instead of subsiding. The butler describes the scene as chaotic in a way that left seasoned staff speechless. Her anger didn't escalate gradually. It was instantaneous, like a switch had been flipped. Words flew with precision and velocity, each one laced with expectation and reprimand. Staff scrambled to correct errors before they compounded. Some tried to explain, but Meghan interrupted them mid-sentence, her tone sharp enough to make even the most confident aides shrink. What made this incident particularly memorable, the butler emphasizes, was Meghan's unpredictability. One moment she was scathing, the next almost soothing, only to pivot back into fury without warning. Staff described it as emotional whiplash. One aide admitted later that they had never experienced anything like it in their professional lives. "I felt like I was constantly guessing, never knowing if the next word would be praise or punishment," the aide recalled. The tension escalated further when a senior staff member, trying to calm the situation, offered a suggestion for better organization. Meghan's response was immediate and explosive. She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper, the kind that fills a room with intensity. "Do you think I don't notice? Every little mistake matters. You are all responsible for every perception I am forced to endure because of your carelessness." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Tears began to flow. Some aides quietly wept at their desks, while others tried to maintain composure, knowing any outward display of weakness could draw further scrutiny. The butler recalls stepping back, observing the scene with a mixture of awe and dread. He knew this wasn't just about a note or a schedule. This was a masterclass in control, in psychological precision, in using emotion as a tool to command attention and compliance. But what happened next truly shocked the household. Meghan, still in a state of heightened emotion, demanded that the aides rearrange the room immediately, correcting every perceived imperfection. The staff worked frantically, moving furniture, adjusting decor, and reprinting documents, all while under the watchful, exacting gaze of the Duchess. And just as they thought they had succeeded, she walked the room again, noting even the smallest misalignment, and pointed out each one with surgical precision. One staff member later admitted that it felt like being trapped in a storm that had no end, a whirlwind of expectation and intimidation, leaving everyone emotionally drained. Yet, amid the fear, there was also a strange sense of loyalty, a compulsion to meet her demands no matter the personal cost. The duality of her behavior, so terrifying in private yet so charming in public, created an environment of intense psychological pressure. And then came the moment that became legendary among the palace staff. Meghan reportedly picked up a crystal ornament, a small but symbolic object, and threw it against the wall in frustration. The sound echoed through the room, a jarring punctuation to the tense atmosphere. Staff froze, some stepping back instinctively, unsure if the act was symbolic or